Australians are getting angry. They've had enough. Why? Because the government is basically trying to do anything else rather than making any real attempt to try and improve housing affordability. And guess what else? No Australian government for the past 30 years has actually made any real attempt to keep housing affordable. And what have we ended up with? The Great Australian Housing Ponzi Scheme. So here we see Albo get heckled a bit as the government is more than happy to spend millions on a new stadium that many say we don't need, while we're in the middle of a housing crisis and many Australians are suffering. And this great lady beautifully interrupted Albo to say what we're all thinking.
Let's talk about housing, Prime Minister.
No, we haven't had our say, Prime Minister. House prices in this country are not just expensive, they're ridiculous. To think that Brisbane and Adelaide have been rated as more unaffordable than New York is an absolute disgrace. We were more than happy to reduce rates to zero, leave them there for 12 months, and stimulate the crap out of the economy. But we're not happy to do anything about the destruction all of these policies have done to the housing market. Now, talking about stimulating things, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to my channel. Here's a prairie horse. Australia has become a country divided. We used to be called the lucky country, and we've historically prided ourselves as being a country where everyone has a fair go. But the housing market is now so broken that Australia is losing its status of being a meritocracy. Now, a meritocracy is the idea that people can get ahead based on their own hard work and accomplishments rather than their parents' social class as an example. But today, Australia seems to be divided down the middle between the property haves and the property have-nots. So is this the sort of country we want to live in, where you only really have decent financial opportunities if your family owns property that's mostly paid off? It's definitely not the sort of thing I want to see. And whether you own a property or not, I think all Australians can agree that having a safe place to live is one of the most important things for people's dignity and well-being. So we have to ask the question again.
Let's talk about housing, Prime Minister.
So how did we get here, and is it now too late to do anything about it? Well, since the late 1990s, early 2000s, successive governments have basically just observed housing affordability deteriorate without actually trying to do anything about it. In other words, just sticking their heads in the sand and just hoping the problem might go away by itself, or just leaving it for others to worry about. Because back in the 1980s and 90s, home ownership was so affordable that the majority of people owned a home. And because of that, governments in power knew that the majority of votes would be coming from homeowners, and therefore they seemed to maintain housing policies that overwhelmingly benefited property owners, because that's where they saw the majority of votes coming from. And the other thing governments did is basically hand over property development to the private sector, hoping that the private sector would build enough properties for people to live in. But property developers don't care that we have enough homes for the entire population. All they really care about is making a profit. And sometimes that can mean waiting on a development until they feel like they have profitable conditions. Now, even though the Australian birth rate has been declining significantly, Australia's population is actually soaring due to high levels of immigration. So we've currently got a soaring population, and the government's hoping the private sector will have enough development to house everyone, while at the same time land is controlled very tightly, meaning there's very limited supply of land, and requests for development can often be very time consuming. Now, another factor is that high house prices contribute to economic growth, and governments love to see their economy growing. So by keeping interest rates as low as possible, maintaining ultra generous housing tax deductions for property owners, and ensuring that there's a soaring population, all but guarantees super high house prices. And when house prices are ultra high, property owners tend to spend more. Many property owners will use that increased equity in their home to spend more in the economy, to get more debt, to loan more for property improvements or a new property investment, which is all good for the economic growth figures, and the governments love it. But surely successive governments wouldn't just ignore the fact that housing were becoming more and more unaffordable. Oh yes, they would. The only real attempt to improve housing affordability in the recent years came when Bill Shorten was leader of the opposition party, and in 2016 and 2019 went to the election with key housing policy changes, specifically specifically to scrap negative gearing and to reduce the capital gains tax discount. Now, those are some policy changes that really get to the root of our housing affordability crisis. You see, ultra generous tax deductions like negative gearing and capital gains tax discount create so much overwhelming demand for property that it's now just basically part of our culture. Because as soon as your baby arrives home from the hospital, you'll be telling them, you gotta buy a property, son. Daughter, you gotta get on the property ladder. But guess what? Labor lost both of those elections, so absolutely no key housing policies were changed. So guess what's happened to housing affordability?
That is one big pile of shit.
And guess what? Now it's the Liberals telling us we're going to have to cut the capital gains tax concession. New South Wales is doing what Bill Shorten couldn't do. Back in 2021, when the Liberal Party were in power in New South Wales, the New South Wales government actually made an argument for winding back the capital gains tax concession. The New South Wales government argued that if capital gains tax discount was cut, housing would be used more for accommodation needs rather than investment, saying that the income made from capital gains is taxed differently from the income made from work or from running a business. And by taxed differently, only half of it is taxed if the property's held for over 12 months. It was almost as though the tax system was screaming at taxpayers to gear up to earn increased capital gains rather than to work harder to get increased wages. So instead of money pouring into high growth companies as the Howard inquiry expected, money flooded into housing which was easier to borrow for. So this caused investors to buy properties that would otherwise have been bought to live in. So apart from massively pushing up prices, the submission from the New South Wales Liberal Party states the most significant impact was the displacement of owner-occupiers, including first home buyers, from home ownership by tax-advantaged investors, predominantly those already on high incomes. Now this is a key reason why our housing affordability has been deteriorating. Property investors have a major advantage over people trying to buy a home to live in. So because all our housing policies encourage more and more investors to buy property and basically to loan as much as they can due to negative gearing, that has the effect of pushing first home buyers and young people out of the property market, which is a major reason why less and less people every year own their own property. Are other countries doing the same thing as Australia and watching housing affordability deteriorate without taking any real action? Well, Canada and New Zealand both have extremely high house prices, so let's look at what they've done. On the Government of Canada website, they've got a section called Making Housing More Affordable with a statement that everyone should have a safe and affordable place to call home, but that goal is increasingly out of reach for far too many Canadians. The government is moving forward with its ambitious package of measures to build more homes and make housing more affordable across the country. So the Canadian government has a clear goal to improve housing affordability. Some measures the Canadian government's put in place recently: a 2-year ban on foreign purchases of Canadian houses, a 1% annual vacant home tax on foreign-owned housing, and cracking down on speculation where a house is resold before it is even constructed or lived in. What's our neighbour New Zealand done? Well, they scrapped their version of negative gearing in 2021, and in 2018, New Zealand banned foreigners from buying existing properties in a move aimed at making properties more affordable. So what do we have here? Two countries similar to Australia who both have the goal of improving housing affordability, who have both taken real tangible action to try and make that happen. Now let's have a look at what Australia's doing to improve housing affordability.
Absolutely nothing.
Well, it starts with diddly and ends with squat. They've got a housing future fund where they've pretty much given all the responsibility to build houses for the next 5 years to the private sector. They've got a first home guarantee where those who can't actually afford a home are encouraged to buy a home, and the government will guarantee up to 15% of the property. But schemes like this do the opposite of improving housing affordability. And they've also got record immigration levels with the potential for 600,000 new migrants to arrive just in 2024. Now this immigration on steroids policy will also do the opposite of improving housing affordability. So the Australian government has not stated any clear mandate or goal to try and improve housing affordability, and they haven't implemented any real action that would reduce speculative demand for housing, which in Australia is at one of the highest levels ever. And why wouldn't it be? You can make way more tax-effective gains through housing than working in a job where you're actually losing money at the moment due to inflation. So there's one question every Australian should be asking.
Let's talk about housing, Prime Minister.
I'm Biko Konstantinos.